This morning I've been asked to talk to you about the development of valid and reliable research instruments. And to be frank, it's not something I ever thought I'd be standing on a stage talking about, but here I am. The wonders of Marlene. Anyway, one of the challenges of research is ensuring, of course, that your instrument used for data collection allows the researcher to answer the question, the research question. That's the very important thing. There's no point going off in a tangent thinking you're going to talk or find out about something that is in no way relevant to your research question. And the steps therefore that are necessary for that to take place are to do with developing a research instrument that is valid and reliable. And it needs to reflect not only the theoretical thinking, and for those of you who heard me yesterday, you know how I love my theory, but also an awareness and understanding of the data analysis and the answers you're going to get to the questions you ask. So what I'm doing this morning then is really describing the process that I went through to develop a valid and reliable questionnaire using an example from my research. Now, it needs to be said, as we're all aware, experienced researchers will tell you the ideal thing is to go and take someone else's instrument, a nice, valid and reliable tool, and use that. However, even though you can set out with the best intentions of doing that, it's when you go to the literature and you find out what's there, you can sometimes find, well, actually, that's not possible. And that's exactly what happened to me. So I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about that process. And it is important to note that, you know, sometimes doing these sort of things can nearly be a PhD in themselves, but we will move on. So just to challenge you a little bit this morning, and I was going to Charlotte, who's been running around with the mic, I was going to get her to chase around the audience and demand that you give me a definition of validity and reliability. But I thought that wouldn't be fair because I have notes in front of me and you don't. But just if you just take a minute to think about what validity and reliability means to you. Even in our normal everyday lives, we have an idea of what the concept of something being valid and something being reliable means. So just to put it in very simple terms, and I understand that I may be insulting a lot of your intelligence, so, but to me these are very simple statements or definitions that I find it very easy to work with. And validity basically says that something, if it's valid, it measures what it claims to measure. Quite simple. And then reliability, consistent results. It basically means that, you know, you're going to get from the instrument the same thing on a repeated basis. And therefore it is difficult, and I mean, Parahu would have said always, Kadir Parahu again, who's one of our professors here, in his research book, he would very clearly state that sometimes we challenge people who are developing new questionnaires to demonstrate the reliability, and that's something that's quite unfair because that can generally only be proven over a period of time when the instruments have been reused and reused. So it's important though to set how I developed my questionnaire within the context of the phases of my study, and I seem to use this diagram forever. It follows me around, but it is really important because you can see very clearly here along the left-hand side of the diagram, the literature review is reflected right down throughout the study, and that is a very important thing when you're doing your research. Your literature review may be a starting point, as in most research it is, but it's something that you continually update and you continually keep dipping back into again and again. So it is a very important thing. Now, the first 3 phases of my research study contributed to the development of my questionnaire, and that's really where I'm going to focus this talk this morning, just on how each of those were able to contribute to the development of my questionnaire. So with all of the good things, again, theory comes into everything, whether we like it or not, and particularly when you're a PhD student. And one of the first contributions that the literature review made to my research was to my tentative theoretical framework. And it is very important to bring that in because it very clearly allowed me to set out what I believed were the 3 most influential factors in my research. The 3 factors which gave me a better understanding, I believed, of the phenomenon of bullying in midwifery. And therefore using this theoretical framework to further guide my study and help me build upon that. It really, I suppose, to sum it up, was like an important precursor to the development of my questionnaire. It helped keep me focused, not only in my research, but in the development of my instrument. So when I was thinking about this, I thought, well, there were four main things, four cornerstones, I suppose, in my instrument development, things that I relied very heavily on so that I could have this valid and reliable instrument to move forward with. The first of those then, as I've mentioned to you already, is the literature review. So all of you will be very familiar with literature reviews and what they're meant to do. But in the context of developing a questionnaire, they allow you to find out what is already known about the topic area, what instruments are already in existence, and this is where sometimes you do as a researcher become very disappointed, because that's where you do think, I'm going to find this wonderful questionnaire that does everything, or instrument that everything I want it to do. And as I've said in my instance, that's not what I found. I found some very interesting instruments that I was able to use as a basis for my research, and I must say it was very encouraging. The authors that I approached to get copies or access to their original instruments were very, very helpful, and that's something that's very important, I think. Meeting other researchers who are willing to share their work with you and willing to share the struggles that they had with their work, because that's quite encouraging, because sometimes when you're in a little bubble doing these things, you can feel that you're the only one who's encountered these problems. But when you speak to others, you'll find that they tend to be very helpful and honest and will tell you, well, actually, this is what it is like, this is reality of research. So one of the other things within the research when I looked at the instruments was looking to see how they were tested, how they were developed, and what the common content was, because that was a very important thing. Again, you get to see not only continually thinking back and reflecting back to my theoretical framework, which looked at the pre-bullying stage, bullying, what happens, the descriptors of bullying behaviour, and then the consequences, the post-bullying stage. It was looking at that. I tried to look at the questionnaires within that context to see whether or not it actually made sense. And so those are the things. It's looking at common content. They were a way of actually helping me understand what I was looking at. And where are the gaps? We all love to find a gap, don't we? That's our future research. So it was looking to see what had been done, what hadn't been done. That was a very important way of finding my way forward. And then on to theory again, and I'm sorry I keep going back to theory, but it is a very important part. It does need to underpin the design of your questionnaire. And it therefore was something that became very clear as I went through the literature and as I identified other instruments, that the instruments that were used to measure bullying and midwifery, they suffered from the same problems that other questionnaires have, in that many of them did not have a theoretical underpinning, and therefore it made it very difficult for me to take it and say, I can use this for my research. One of the big things that I noticed was that there was a gap in, or a lack of consensus on a definition of bullying. That was a big thing for me, because I thought if we can't really define it very well, if we haven't clearly defined it, then it's very difficult to develop a questionnaire about something that's not clearly defined. So that was a really big shock to me, really, because I was so convinced. I'd read so much, I thought there's bound to be an agreement here, but there wasn't an agreement. So I went forward with one of my second phase of my study, which really was the concept analysis. And this included looking at the definitions that were out there, looking at the common themes within them, and then trying to identify those attributes that defined bullying and clearly set it apart from any other concept. And they were things like the repeated behaviour, the difficulty that the victim of bullying has in defending themselves, the fact that it would have a negative impact on the victim, and then that other more sort of difficult one to deal with, the intent of the bully. But those were the defining attributes that I found when I looked in the literature. I also, and again this is a very important thing if you think back again to my theoretical framework, and this is where you're trying to keep building everything together. And the antecedents were very much the pre-bullying. What happens before the bullying starts, or what is it that leads to bullying happening? And again, the literature allowed me to draw that out, and the concept analysis allowed me to set it very clearly. And the consequences, what happens to those who are bullied? What happens to them as an individual? What happens to them as a professional? And what happens to the organisations in which they work where this bullying happens? And very importantly then, for me, as I started to develop and look at the questionnaires that were available and think about developing my own questionnaire, it was very important for me to consider cross-referencing the questions that I want to include with this concept analysis so that I could clearly thread the links through. And then expert opinion. I have found that it's invaluable, as I've said, if you speak to others who have carried out research in your area or in similar areas. People tend to be very helpful at giving you some pointers and information. And I did speak to quite a few people about developments of questionnaires, about bullying in itself, and they are very helpful at coming forward and telling you, yes, this means something to me, and helping you deal with some of the common problems that you come across. Also, it's very important that as using others to validate and look at what you're doing and see whether it makes sense to them, because sometimes you're so close to what you're doing, it's very hard to actually look at it in any sort of objective way. And you become immersed in everything and it makes sense to you, but what you really need to do is step back from it, allow others, and it's quite hard to do that at times because it's very hard to have your work criticised. You need to be able to step back and in my case I was handing it to my supervisors and saying, please look at this, does this make sense? And they were able to come back and help me thread my way through it as well, so that was very helpful. Importantly though, I needed to be also aware that I was developing this tool within midwifery, bullying in midwifery. So it was very important to have an input from people within the context of midwifery. So thankfully I had very willing, able volunteers to come forward into focus groups. So I had midwives from academia, midwives from unions,